Good afternoon and good evening. I'm here with my fellow anchor,
Natalie.
and my name's Allie. Today we're going to be discussing the coronavirus in Canada, and moreover,
More specifically, we're going to be looking at how identity developed in Canada during the pandemic.
all right, so let's send it over to our off-field reporter, Logan Hall.
Thank you guys so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm Logan Hall, and I will be giving a little background information on the history and culture of our northern neighbors, Canada. So, Canada gained its independence from England and the United Kingdom in 1982, and it dissolved its effects of the Crown dependency. Further on, Canada has a very liberal culture, especially in vast population hubs such as Toronto and Vancouver. Now, the rural areas do not share this complete same love of liberal policy that the population centers do, and that can at times cause a little divide in the country. Canada's parliamentary democracy is one of the most stable democracies in the world and has over time completed traditional models of power and movement structures over time. The Prime Minister of Canada is Justin Trudeau, and he is part of the Liberal Party. And thank you for letting me do a slow introduction. I'm going to send it back to the studio.
Now, a lot of people will be asking yourself, what is the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, COVID-19 stands for coronavirus, which is a pandemic that hit the world in 2020, and it caused millions of deaths globally. Now, in Canada specifically, the COVID-19 pandemic was responsible for an amount of deaths ranging between 50 to 60,000, depending on the numbers. The closest number that we could find is about 50,000 deaths. However, the COVID-19 pandemic affected people in a way that was more than just livelihood and death. It also had a massive societal and economic effect on the country, as it resulted in a nationwide shutdown, which resulted in businesses closing and an overall effect of both morale and income in different family households.
Thank you, Logan and Bella, for that riveting content.
Now, my co-host Allie is going to talk about who Canada blamed for the pandemic.
Let's do this thing. In a recent study conducted, it has been revealed that a significant portion of the Canadian population, approximately 50%, holds China responsible for the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the aftermath of the pandemic, there are growing concerns that focusing on assigning blame will only exacerbate existing divisions, according to some experts. In a recent study conducted by Angus Reid, it has been found that a significant portion of Canadians, 44%, hold the belief that China purposely concealed vital information regarding the initial spread of the novel coronavirus in late 2019. The findings come from the 2022 Angus Reid report, shedding light on the sentiments of the Canadian population towards China's handling of the pandemic's early stages. The report also revealed that 30% of respondents have placed blame on Chinese Canadians for the crisis that unfolded. Because racial bias sometimes appears during times of high anxiety and instability, like a pandemic, researchers noted that these opinions most likely originated from these prejudices. In a recent development, experts are cautioning against the continuation of discriminatory mindsets as the threat of COVID-19 diminishes. In a remarkable display of global unity, world leaders, including New Zealand's Prime Minister, unequivocally denounced the act of singling out any specific group and assigning blame for the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. Ardner's resolute statement made last year emphasized the collective responsibility of nations to combat the crisis without resorting to scapegoating. This powerful message from a prominent leader serves as a reminder of the importance of solidarity and cooperation in the face of unprecedented global challenges. In a recent development, the World Health Organization has issued a cautionary statement regarding the association of the virus with particular populations or regions, emphasizing the need for responsible reporting. The World Health Organization has urged against making connections between viruses and specific groups of people or geographical locations. This advisory comes amidst growing concerns over the stigmatization and discrimination faced by certain communities due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization's stance underscores the importance of promoting unity and understanding during these challenging times. In a concerning development, Asian advocacy groups in Canada have recently reported a significant increase in both verbal and physical attacks with racist undertones. These incidents have been on the rise over the past 3 years, raising alarms among communities in the country. In a recent study conducted by Dalhousie University, it has been revealed that a significant number of Asian Canadians have experienced racist insults or assaults since the year 2020. The study indicates that about 60% of individuals from the Asian Canadian community have been subjected to such discriminatory behavior. These distressing findings shed light on the prevalence of racial discrimination faced by Asian Canadians in recent times. In a contentious debate, activists have voiced their concerns that racism has caused deep divisions within communities at a time when unity and solidarity are most crucial. In a recent development, it has been observed that despite the conclusions of the immediate health crisis, anti-Asian racism continues to persist in ways that are causing concern. In an ongoing effort to rebuild and foster healing, Canada is embracing a valuable lesson: prioritizing compassion over condemnation. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the task of preserving social cohesion in our communities may necessitate a deliberate effort to combat the prejudice and resentment that emerged during these tumultuous times. Wow, I know who to blame for that great reporting.
Thank you for that. Now let's send it over to Logan, who's going to talk about societal divisions in Canada.
Thank you guys so much for that introduction again. I'm here to talk about Canada's societal woes, basically. How COVID in Canada has really been used and unfortunately been abused in creating societal divisions and just societal distress in Canada. So when COVID really started, no one really had too big of an issue with the actions that the administration in place, which was the Liberal Party at the time, and Justin Trudeau, that took the policies they put in place in order to try and calm the spread of COVID and really slow it to really help the population as a whole. You see, in the beginning, they did what most countries did. They asked for people stay at home when necessary. It was kind of iffy up in the air on if it was really necessary for them. So a lot of people just didn't listen to that. However, things that people did do were they would wear a mask, they would social distance, and they would take just normal hygienic precautions per usual. They'd wash their hands, they would use hand sanitizer. One thing that most people ended up doing was instead of shaking hands, they'd use just an elbow greeting instead. Now, this was all fine and dandy until stay-at-home orders became orders, really. People were more forced to do it. So there was punishments of crimes if you were to leave your house for unnecessary reasons, and this really, really began to sow a division in Canada between the liberal left and the conservative right, who ultimately disagreed on stay-at-home orders. This division continued to grow between the left and the right, and ultimately it resulted in some mild protests beginning in Canada. Small ones happened in Vancouver, which unsurprisingly is more of a liberal area of Canada, so they had less protests. However, in a rather conservative province like Alberta, massive amounts of protests began to take place. Upwards of 20 to 30 over the months began building, and the disdain for the administration in power really became clear in those areas. Along with Alberta, Ontario had massive amounts of protests as people would converge all together to try and use their own freedom of speech to get policy changes that would unfortunately often result in no change. However, it would make their voices more clear, and it showed that a division was beginning in Canada. Now, division began to become fully sown in the country between the right and the left when COVID-19 vaccine mandates became popular. See, they started with just government employees being required to be vaccinated. These people, at the time, while controversial, mostly accepted this and would get vaccinated as it was required for their job. However, not everybody supported this, and some people were fired over the incident. Now, this was very unpopular in the country and became even more unpopular when Justin Trudeau began to try and enforce a vaccine mandate for truck drivers. Truck drivers took very poorly to this and decided to come together and start what is now known as the Canadian Trucking Protest, where truckers from all across the country came together, converging on Ontario, the capital of Canada, in protest to show Justin Trudeau that they did not support his mandate. They all met there and they all showed up waving Canadian flags, showing that they did not support the administration. This really hit a fever pitch in Canada, dividing the country right in half, with people who supported the mandates and the people who did not support the mandates, these being the Conservatives and the Liberals for the most part. Now, ever since this, Justin Trudeau's approval rating has continued to slide. The Liberal Party in Canada has continued to lose seats in Parliament, as their policies, viewed at the beginning of COVID to now, have just been more and more unpopular for Canadian people. This overall has divided Canada right in half, the people on the left and the people on the right. Now, overall, Canada is still a prosperous, thriving country, but those societal differences have become very obvious ever since Canada's COVID response and their reaction of time. Thank you so much for giving me this time to speak. I'm going to send it back to the studio.
Thank you for those insights, Logan.
Now, speaking from one woman to another, I'd like to know how our rights were affected during the corona pandemic, especially in Canada. Do you know anyone who could help me with that?
I think I know a girl.
Excellent.
Now, you may be wondering, how did Canada's pandemic response impact the level of women's rights and representation in the country? Perhaps the biggest impact the pandemic response had on women in Canada is in the realm of violence against women, specifically violence in the household, such as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. The COVID-19 pandemic became heavily associated with higher risks of gender-based violence. This violence is also a leading cause of homelessness among women. National surveys conducted by women's service providers studying violence against women found that 34 to 52% of respondents experienced an increase in severity of violence and mental health challenges. A contributor to this is the difficulty of accessing these services that the pandemic caused. It's much more difficult to escape an abusive partner or receive mental health treatment when social distancing and quarantines are factored into the equation. It's also important to note that Indigenous women in Canada were much more likely to contract coronavirus and were therefore more exposed to its gendered effects. During the first 6 months of the pandemic, Canada put on hold its national action plans for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and its national Indigenous housing strategy, which created even greater disparities for Native women. However, Canada did identify the violence women were experiencing during the pandemic and targeted it by implementing various policies. In May 2020, the federal government committed $76 million to nonprofit violence against women organizations and violence against women shelters. They also committed $10 million to shelters serving Indigenous women and children fleeing violence on reserves. In 2022, as the pandemic cooled down a little bit, the Canadian government created a major budget change to enact a national action plan to end gender-based violence over the course of 5 years. In addition, women in Canada represent a much greater proportion of essential service providers, healthcare workers, and informal caregivers. Let's examine how informal caregiving evolved for women, especially mothers, during the pandemic. As shutdowns and quarantines began, it became apparent that women would have to take on more of the childcare and unpaid domestic duties and responsibilities than men. Pre-existing gender disparities in childcare were exacerbated as schools shut down and children needed a full-time caretaker at home. In many cases, this caretaker, usually the mother, also became their full-time school teacher and full-time cook. To make matters worse, about 17% of all families in Canada are single-parent, and 80% of those single-parent families are led by women. Single mothers experienced even greater anxiety and financial hardship during the pandemic. The fact that women represent a higher percentage of essential service workers in Canada puts them at a higher health risk. They are the majority of staff in janitorial service, retail service, personal support care, healthcare, and even in the nonprofit sector. And, on average, the personal protective equipment, such as masks, that is supposed to protect people from contracting the disease, is on average too large for women, putting them at a greater health risk. Not only were women put in danger at their jobs during the pandemic, but they were also losing their jobs at an alarming rate. According to a report of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women in Canada, women lost their jobs at approximately twice the rate of men during the first month of the pandemic. Mothers represented 57% of parents who lost their jobs, or most of their hours, by the end of that first May. And single mothers were more likely to lose work than mothers in two-parent families. Since women make up the majority of careers, such as retail, pandemic policies that shut businesses down had a greater impact on them. Female entrepreneurs and businesswomen were also particularly impacted by pandemic policies. The Committee on the Status of Women in Canada heard many witnesses appeal to them about the struggles of businesswomen. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, businesses owned by women were less likely than businesses owned by men to be fully opened, fully staffed, or experiencing normal levels of sales as of early November 2020. Female entrepreneurs also struggled to receive funding during the pandemic. All of these difficulties put women at a disadvantage in the workforce, both during and after the pandemic. So it's clear that the pandemic was a highly gendered event in Canada, but I say we can hope that with time and attention from the national government, women can eventually achieve a higher standard of rights and representation.
That girl sure knows about women and their rights.
Right? I hardly know her.
Now we're going to send it over to Bella, who's going to talk about political identities in Canada.
So before understanding the impacts of the COVID-19 virus on Canada's political identities, we first need to understand what were the political identities of Canada to begin with. To start off, let's set the stage. About 2019, maybe half a year before the COVID-19 pandemic hit Canada, Justin Trudeau and his party had just lost their commanding majority in Parliament as a whole, which meant they were now operating in a minority-controlled Parliament with a Parliament that was controlled by the opposition party. Now, it's important to realize that they suffered a resounding loss in the election prior to COVID-19's arrival in the Canadian scene, which means that when Justin Trudeau and his electoral group were thinking about policies for the upcoming year in 2020, they never thought they'd have to deal with the pandemic. And of course, the people of Canada didn't think they need to consider a pandemic as something that they were voting on. So it's typical that conservative voters will look more skeptically on a Liberal government, with Liberal governments getting a more favorable response from Liberal voters. But what actually happened in the context of Canada during this time? So for starters, about 53% of conservative voters said they felt incredibly confident in the way Trudeau and his administration were handling the issue. That contrasts with a little bit over 80% of Liberal voters who felt that the Trudeau administration had been handling it incredibly successfully. But it's important to note that when responding to these polls, an overwhelming number of conservative voters said that even if they wouldn't have voted for Trudeau or maybe didn't think he had handled it super successfully, they had a favorably positive outlook on him and his administration, which I think reflects a much larger approval for the Liberal Party of Canada at this time, something which was very much not seen in the election beforehand. Now, I've spent all this time talking about the approval rating of Trudeau and the Liberal Party and how the public response to their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic was overwhelmingly positive. So one might think in the election that followed, the results would reflect that, right? The answer is no. Shockingly, the answer is no.
So how did Justin Trudeau and his Liberal Party get from a place of joint public approval between Conservative and Liberals to a place where his Liberal Party couldn't even win the following election? The answer is very simple, and it's in all of the protests and failures in legislative policy that Logan talked about earlier. But it's important to recognize that in the earliest stages of terror in the pandemic, Justin Trudeau was able to take a quick start in handling those decisions and uniting Conservative and Liberals behind him. Unfortunately, that unity would not stay for his entire handling of the pandemic, and divisions would increase and continue to increase between those two parties as his decisions became more and more controversial and divisive within the country, eventually leading to the Liberal Party being unable to accomplish a majority leadership in Parliament.
And that's all for today, folks.
Well, thank you for watching NLB News. And I think one thing we should really emphasize before we go is one thing that was prevalent in all of our research, which was that in this time of terror, Canada came together as a community. And I think that that's really important for all of us to remember, that despite the darkness, we can always find love within each other.
That is very wonderful.
Very true. Have a lovely rest of your day, Canada.